So there are more than 100 ways of growing a potato. You could do the trench method, you could grow it in a hotbed, you can grow them in containers filled with compost, you could grow them under seaweed, under hay, in a polytunnel, in a hoop bed. You kind of get the idea. The important thing that I want you to know is that a lot of YouTubers or TV gardeners will be like, this is the best way, or like their favorite way of doing something. But it doesn't mean that it's the best way for you, because we all have different goals, different needs, and it's important to realize that. And I think, yes, it can be overwhelming thinking that there's 100 different ways of growing potatoes, but I think it's exciting because it allows us to choose what makes best sense for us. If, you know, I do think if I was to choose one way, if resources were infinite, it would be growing it in just loads of compost or loads of well-rotted manure. But that isn't possible. And compost is very valuable. And so there's so many other ways that you can grow potatoes rather than just in compost. And I think that that's kind of exciting. You can use it in so many different ways. But this video isn't actually about talking about all of the different methods of growing potatoes. It comes into it. But this video is kind of maybe a little bit more unconventional potato growing advice, because it's something that, especially for beginner gardeners, or it's just kind of a consideration that I suddenly realized and I think is important to share, is that if you want a productive garden, you have to work with the certain characteristics that different crops give you. And as well, for a productive garden, I may grow the same crop using 3 different methods throughout the growing season that makes the most sense based off what the soil needs and all of those different things. Now, with me having the last average frost date in mid-May and the first average frost date in kind of mid-October, you might be surprised to say that I actually have an 8-month planting window for potatoes if I want. The way that it works is by kind of throwing away how we usually see what first earlies are, second earlies, main crop. First earlies aren't just about getting that first harvest of potatoes of the new growing season. Of course, that's a big benefit, but one of the best times to plant first early potatoes is, in fact, towards late July into early August, because rather than thinking about it being the first harvest and then by mid-April you've missed the window, what you actually want to look at is the characteristic of what is a first early. It's a fast maturing variety. If you plant it, you can expect to harvest it in around 10 weeks. For varieties like Swift, you could get your first early harvest in about 8 weeks. And so if I'm thinking about the tail of the growing season that is capped by that kind of first average frost date in mid-October, if I can plant a first early in the ground, I could actually, in August, I could still look at potentially getting a harvest. I definitely would if it was in a polytunnel, but even outside, I could potentially squeeze in a harvest. And so it's about understanding what works and what doesn't. The other thing that I really don't bother doing, unless it's starting off potatoes in January and February, or right at the end of the growing season in late July or August, is chitting. I don't chit my potatoes, mainly because I'm a little bit lazy of a gardener, and plants just want to grow. The other day, I was pulling out potatoes from under the kale behind me, because there were potatoes growing there last year and then interplanted with the kale, and now the kale is interplanted with broad beans. But I had to remove a few of the volunteer potatoes which were already appearing. Those weren't chitted. They stood in the ground all through winter. It's very easy to overcomplicate things, and I think as soon as we take a step back and realise there's so many different things, so many different approaches that we can apply, but a potato just wants to grow, it can kind of be quite liberating. And so the goal of chitting is that, yes, you can get a little bit of an earlier head start. So if you wanted to do your first new potato planting in January, it means that if you chit, you can start chitting kind of the start of December. So by January, you do have a little bit of a head start. But between the months of March and June, even into early July, I really don't think it's necessary. Another thing you can do as well is you can cut potatoes up into pieces. That really does work. I'm going to be doing a lot of experiments over the next few growing seasons because there's so much to explore in the land of potatoes. I've got to try 100 different ways of growing them as well to see what is the best. I'm joking, there's no such thing as the best, but it's an exciting prospect. And so just thinking about the calendar, that 8-month planting window, if it was say January and February, I'd very much focus on hotbeds. It can either be outside or it could be hotbeds under cover, especially in the month of January. When it starts to cool down, you could always put a bit of protection over the top, but that's very simple. In the month of February, towards the second half, you can then look at all of the undercover options like a polytunnel or a hinged hoop house, or in containers in a polytunnel to then bring out later on. March, towards the end of March, is when you can start to look at planting outside. You've got to remember that potatoes usually take around 2 to 3 weeks before they make an appearance, and it's when they make an appearance that you have to start worrying about frost conditions. Of course, if you're in a really cold climate, then it might not actually be possible to plant outside in March or even into early April if you have deep freezes, and so you just look at undercover growing instead. April and May are kind of the 2 months where you can just grow whatever you want. Main crops, for them to mature compared to first early potatoes, they take around 15 to 16 weeks, but it can be longer than that. And so that is kind of the fringe. And for me, the easiest thing to do, when it's the growing season, I like to work with the seasons as much as possible. And during that time, all of the potatoes that I'm going to be planting are outside, because I do need to think about prioritizing space. If I'm growing in a polytunnel and I want to grow an early crop of potatoes, I want to make sure that those are in January, and then by the time I start harvesting those either in April or right at the start of May, that is when I'm then going to be putting in my tomato plants. So I'm always thinking ahead. I'm always thinking about, is there crossover? Where does this fit? But the thing about a vegetable garden is in July, you start to have pockets, or you start to have gaps emerging from around the garden. And the fact that you could just grow a few extra potatoes is really nice. Obviously, there is a slight caveat with all of this, which is the horrible disease of blight, potato blight, especially late blight. The way of going around this is looking just at the whole variety, not of just Sarpo Mira, which everyone who watches this channel knows that I love growing that as a main crop because it doesn't get any blight, but looking at any of the other Sarpo varieties. I will list a few down in the video description of different ones that are recommended. One of the things I'm going to be trying out firstly this year, I'm going to be cutting up potatoes that have all of their individual eyes, and I'm going to be starting those off in pots under cover and then transplanting them outside, and always having a few potato plants that I can transplant outside. I've seen a couple of people do it and it looks really interesting, and so I want to give it a go. Now, if you're just trying to grow as much food as possible, then there are some simple things when it comes to potatoes as like rules. They love fertility. They need as much nutrition as possible. And if you want to see how we use potatoes within this garden, you can get a copy of the Self-Sufficiency Garden book that I co-authored with my friend and colleague Sam Cooper. And the book is a #1 Sunday Times bestseller, which has completely shocked us. And for those of you in America, if you order via bookshop.org, there is a 15% discount. So check out the book and watch this video next, which shows you how I'm trying to turn this site to be completely self-sufficient when it comes to compost.